We'll open this Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development of Tuesday, May 29th, 2007. Committee members, you have the orders of the day before you. Today, we'll be studying the main estimates of 2007, 2008, and votes 1, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, L30, L35, 40, 45, 50, 55, and 60 under the Indian Affairs and Northern Development. I call for vote 1. Today, appearing before us, we have the Honourable Jim Prentice, Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. And further witnesses from the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, we have Michael Wernick, Deputy Minister, Peter Harrison, Senior Associate Deputy Minister, and Jim Quinn, Chief Financial Officer. Welcome. Mr. Minister, would you like to open with some comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Be pleased to do so. Just like to say good morning to yourself, to the members of the committee. Thank you very much. I look forward to our dialogue here today. I thank you for the opportunity to discuss the main estimates of the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development with yourself and your colleagues this morning. And I'm grateful for the attention that this committee has given to my department's agenda over the past year, I guess to our collective agenda. I appreciate your consideration of these important issues, including post-secondary education, housing, as well as legislative initiatives such as Bill C-34 and Bill C-44, which are now before the committee. I know that we all share the same objectives, which is to say improving the quality of life for Aboriginal people and Northerners. L'administration des comptes d'affaires indiens.
As you know, Mr. Michael Warner, the Deputy Minister, recently announced extra budgets for the department. Today I will be talking about the main estimates, which is the next stage of the planning cycle for the budget. I will also be talking about the improvements that we plan to implement in order to improve the life quality of Aboriginal peoples and people in the north.
2008 main estimates include $6.3 billion for our department. This represents a net increase of $36 million from 2006-2007. One point I would like to emphasize, particularly for Mr. Lemay, the main estimates are, of course, simply the first step in the fiscal cycle, the starting point, and they do not include resources that will be allocated through supplementary estimates. So, Mr. Chairman, funded by the main and supplementary estimates, we are determined to move forward in clearly defined ways through approaches and initiatives that will affect real change in Aboriginal communities, and furthermore will give Aboriginal people the tools and organizational structures that they need to take charge of their own future. I felt from the time I became the minister we must need to effect structural reforms, in particular to protect women and children and to ensure that women are in a position to move forward and advocate on behalf of their children. Tout d'abord, il nous faut procéder à une réforme structurelle.
We need to implement a structural reform in order to ensure protection of women, children and families. Legislative work is required, such as, for example, this may well take the form of the repeal of Section 67 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, or it could take the form of a change in policies and programs. We must ensure that Aboriginal women, children and families have the same rights and have access to the same quality of services as all other Canadians.
Matrimonial real property, and our recent partnership with the province of Alberta and Alberta First Nations to implement a new approach to child and family services are recent examples of new and innovative thinking, new approaches to the existing challenges in First Nation communities. I'm confident that working in partnership with the provinces, territories and Aboriginal groups, we can build on successes such as these. Secondly, we have to consolidate economic development tools to obtain the maximum efficiency from our programs and services, and so that we can enable First Nations to take charge of their own economic development. And that is why the Aboriginal Business Canada program and the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board were unified under my department in December of 2006. This is an important initiative, and there will be more said about this in the future, and it is one of the important structural changes that needed to be made to ensure that the department has the tools to deal with economic development, which I think we all would agree is a significant part of the way forward. Furthermore, under the Aboriginal Workplace Partnership initiatives, we have formalized partnerships with local governments, influential businesses, and trade unions to promote the employment of an Aboriginal labour force. And I'm especially proud of the agreements that have been signed in the past several months, agreements such as these with Siemens Canada Limited in Saskatoon, the City of Edmonton, the Calgary Health Region, the Nova Scotia Nurses Union, the Nova Scotia Trucking Human Resources Council. All of these agreements will bolster the number of employment opportunities available to Aboriginal people. And to give you another example, this government allocated $300 million in budget 2007 for the establishment of the First Nations Market Housing Fund. This fund will enable First Nation families and individuals to purchase, build, and renovate on-reserve housing that meets their specific needs and tastes. And I think everyone in the room is familiar that a key aspect of this is the leverage that is available from the $300 million, leverage that would be in the nature of 4 or 5 to 1. So it's not simply $300 million. It accesses private mortgage capital in excess of $1.5 billion that will be available over time for First Nation housing. Nous nous attendons à ce que le programme permette de
The program is expected to help finance the development of approximately 25,000 new housing units over the next 10 years. But the First Nations Market Housing Fund will not only encourage housing development. It will also help First Nation people living on reserve to obtain bank loans, build equity, and generate wealth through home ownership.
To address the existing approach to the resolution of Aboriginal land claims, I'm happy to point out that there have been some marked recent successes. The Nunavik Inuit Land Claims Agreement, for instance, was signed in December of last year, resolving this country's last major Inuit land claim, Bill C-51. Bill C-51, which ratifies this agreement, has recently been introduced in the House, and last year 3 treaties were also initialed in the province of British Columbia. These were the first to be initiated under the BC treaty process. Much more needs to be done. I know that all of the members here today are eager to discuss these plans and to address the current untenable situation presented by the specific claims process. And although I'm not in a position to elaborate at this time, I'm pleased to note that we have committed to and intend to announce a new approach to the resolution of this long-standing national issue. Fourth, we have to work to enable the participation of Aboriginal people in major resource development opportunities. And the close proximity of our First Nation communities to resource development presents opportunities, allows people to participate in these projects in a meaningful manner and to share in the social and economic benefits that are generated by these initiatives. And I know we've all seen examples of this sort of success in the past. I observed that in the context of Voisey's Bay, for example, close to 50% of the workforce working at that facility are First Nation citizens. If you go to the diamond mines in the Northwest Territories in the Tulicho area, you'll find that, as I recall, in excess of 30% of the people working at those facilities are First Nation citizens. So we are making progress. This government recently passed regulations under the First Nations Commercial Industrial Development Act that will enable the Fort McKay First Nation, in partnership with Shell Canada, to develop a multi-billion-dollar oil sands mine in northern Alberta. This is the first initiative of its kind. The project will attract investors from around the world, create hundreds of meaningful, well-paying jobs for community residents.
Nous avons également prévu
We have also dedicated $500 million to the Mackenzie Valley Socioeconomic Impact Fund. Committed in Budget 2006, this fund will assist those communities whose development is affected by the proposed Mackenzie gas project, should the project proceed.
We continue to work forward addressing the residential school matter. I'm pleased to report to the committee that the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement has received final court approval, and now former students and their families must choose whether to stay in the agreement or remove themselves from it. All parties to this historic agreement have agreed to a fair resolution of this sad legacy and chapter in the history of our country. Our new government recognizes the importance of achieving a fair and a lasting resolution of the Indian residential schools legacy and moving forward in partnership with Aboriginal communities across Canada. You will be aware that in my early months as minister, I brought the closure, along with Minister Oda, to the negotiations surrounding the Indian residential school settlement. And that's also why we supported the motion for the House of Commons to apologize for the legacy of the Indian Residential Schools Agreement, which happened a month or so ago, the apology. We are moving forward with the implementation of the agreement at this point, potentially as early as September of this year, once the opt-out period is finished. And in particular, we look forward to the important work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is an element of this historic agreement, and will provide a complete historic record of the unfortunate legacy of which we speak. This department is not only responsible for First Nation, Inuit and Northern issues, but I'm also the federal interlocutor for Métis and non-status Indians, and my official work with Métis and non-status Indians and urban Aboriginal people in order to assist them in realizing their full economic and social potential. In this capacity, we recently announced a refocused urban Aboriginal strategy in Edmonton, concentrating on job training and entrepreneurship for the nearly 50% of Aboriginal people who live in cities and towns across the country. The approach to the urban Aboriginal strategy is based upon a focus on the larger metropolitan centres, 12 in number as I recall. The strategy unites federal, provincial, municipal governments as well as Aboriginal communities and organizations and invests $68.5 million over 5 years to improve the life and employment skills, to promote entrepreneurship, and provide support to Aboriginal women, children, and families. Monsieur le Président, vous et vos collègues.
Mr. Chairman, you and your colleagues are quite aware that the North is an important part of my mandate. Canada's new government is committed to working with Canada's 3 northern territories to develop the North's natural resources and, as well, to create jobs and prosperity for Northerners and, indeed, for all Canadians.
The North holds a significant percentage of Canada's energy resources. They present an immense opportunity for exploration and development, investment for generations to come. Resource-based projects in the North include diamond mines, oil and gas exploration, and other mining activity. They've contributed to increased economic growth in the North over the past number of years. This economic growth, besides being the means of improving quality of life for Northerners, also serves to bolster Canadian sovereignty in the North, raising the profile of Canada as an Arctic nation. We must do what we can to ensure that the current boom in the North continues to the benefit of Northerners and other Canadians alike. International Polar Year, 2007-2008, was also launched on March 1st, and this will be another enabler of growth and development in the North. We expect that the research by Canadian and international scientists funded through the International Polar Year program will lead to new knowledge, environmental, health, economic benefits to Canadians in the North and across our nation. Les deux principaux thèmes scientifiques de l'année.
The two key themes for International Polar Year Science, which are climate change impacts and adaptation, and the health and well-being of northern communities, will be important to many nations, given the global effects of climate change.
To note that while funding is a crucial element in the success of our programs and initiatives, it is not the only significant factor. I have said before that continuing to fund existing programs without considering their validity or efficiency is not good enough. We must continue to consider whether the means by which we currently deliver services is truly producing the best results for Aboriginal peoples and Northerners. The funding provided in the main estimates is essential to maintain and advance programs to improve the quality of life for Aboriginal people and Northerners. Je serai heureux de recevoir de vos questions et de vos commentaires.
I welcome any questions or comments you may have.
It is a pleasure to be here. I know that we have at this table a reservoir of knowledge concerning Aboriginal issues, Northern issues, and I look forward to an opportunity to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We will begin our questioning with Anita Neville. Madam Neville, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Minister, thank you very much for being here today. We particularly appreciate that you've given us the full 2 hours today. I have many, many questions, so I will begin and see how far it takes me. My first question is related to the overall departmental spending and your priorities. On separate occasions, I've heard you say the total Aboriginal spending is $9.1 billion, $10 billion, and once even $11 billion. I haven't heard a consistent message. The one message I have heard from you is that spending from your department, and you've reiterated it today, has committed is enough for Aboriginals. The numbers that have been cited, to my mind, have been misleading and certainly lack clarity, and the distinctions between all Aboriginal spending and First Nations spending is certainly blurred. The report that we're studying today, it shows that departmental estimates are just over $6.3 billion. Can you identify to us, or are you willing to identify for us, the disaggregated figures so that people can understand the distinctions? Can you tell us how much the department is spending, how much of what the department is spending will reach First Nations communities, Aboriginals, on and off reserve, the Inuit, the Métis? And then I have several other questions.
I'm pleased to do that. We can work through that in an orderly way, and I think we would all agree it is sometimes difficult in the context of a brief 30-second period and question period to convey the complexity of all of this. The expenditures by the Government of Canada this year directed to Aboriginal people in 2007-2008 total $10.2 billion. In addition to that, there are the dollars that will be expended on the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which I do not put into the $10.2 billion, but they are, we can talk separately about those. It's an additional sum of in excess of $2.2 billion that will be spent on the Residential School Agreement. So dealing with the $10.2 billion, it might assist you if I just pointed out that how this breaks down across the Government of Canada. Indian and Northern Affairs Canada is $6.7 billion, which is 65% of that total. Health Canada is $2.1 billion, which is 21% of that total. CMHC is $300 million, which is 3% of the total. HRSD is $400 million, which is 3.7% of the total. Other departments and agencies are $500 million, which is 4.6% of the total. And then in addition to that, you have dollars that are being expended now that were included in budget 2006, which have been allocated to this fiscal year. You'll recall that there were significant dollars for housing, for example. The portions of those for this year, if included, amount to another $300 million, or 2.4%. So that is the total of the $10.2 billion and where it is found across the Government of Canada. So I think that's a partial response to your question. In terms of expenditures on reserve, $7.4 billion of the $10.2 billion is allocated to programs and services for First Nation citizens living on reserve, and that equates to per capita spending of $16,500 per citizen, based on an updated estimate of the population of on-reserve Canadians of 448,000 people.
Can I interrupt you? Is that direct money to the community, or does that include administrative costs in your department?
That would include administrative costs as well, but we can talk about that separately. The administrative costs of the department are actually quite modest. The Department of Indian and Northern Affairs over the last 20 years has been effectively downsized from a department that had close to 12,000 employees to one that has a little more than 4,000 employees. The Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development is largely a funding agent that provides funds directly to First Nation citizens.
I'm interested in knowing what individuals receive, Minister, please.
Well,
or what communities receive, rather than, I just want to know that whether the figures are calculated into that 16,000, because it's a different perception.
What's that? Which is
sorry, if you look at the grants and contribution vote on what you have in front of you,
yes,
is the $5.2 billion is the direct grants and contributions that are made. That's not the sum total of the expenses. But back to your point, of the $6.3 billion that is spent, 82% of that, or $5.2 billion, is administered directly by the bands, the First Nations themselves.
Follow-up. Minister, you've identified very clearly in your document that your priorities are women and children, and I think no one can disagree with you. How we get there is a matter of discussion and sometimes disagreement. I guess my question is, in determining the priorities for Aboriginal Canadians, why are you not addressing the concerns that they prioritize, that they come forward with and say are there immediate issues, and why are you determining the priorities rather than allowing them full and proper participation in the establishment of those priorities?
Well, I wouldn't agree with the premise of the question. We've been working together with First Nation leaders responding to the very issues that have been brought forward. And I can tell you in the course of the last month alone, I've met with the chiefs of the Union of Ontario Indians, the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. This weekend I met with the Leadership Council in British Columbia.
Aware of that.
In all of these areas, we are responding directly to the current concerns. And in terms of women and children in particular, when I became the minister, I made it quite clear that the Child and Family Services side of the department is one that required serious renovation, and we set about doing that. We have this spring rolled out what first in Alberta, what has been called the early response model. It is a complete restructuring of the child welfare authorities under which this department operates. It is a reform which has been required in this country for really for at least 25 years. And this is the government that's actually doing it, and we're making the investments. It's been brought into place first in Alberta with the unanimous consent of every single First Nation in Alberta, plus the Alberta government. We're now engaged in discussions with other provinces and First Nations who want to move forward. I met with representatives of the provincial government in Saskatchewan and the FSIN. This is their #1 priority, and we're working together with them to move forward immediately. Moving forward similarly in the next very short period of time with British Columbia. So that's an illustration of what is clearly the #1 priority amongst First Nations in that part of Canada, which is child and family service authorities and the large number of kids in care. And we are moving forward on their priorities. I add to that a similar approach on education, where when I became the minister, it is clear to me, I think clear to all of us in the room, that we're not making the strides on Aboriginal education that we need to. We therefore developed, in concert with the government of British Columbia and First Nations, on a voluntary basis in British Columbia, a new approach to education, and we are now in the process of taking that same approach forward, working with other First Nations and provinces who want to implement that same approach. So we are responding directly on the issue of women and children to the priorities of First Nation citizens. On other issues requiring structural change, such as matrimonial property.
Am I out of time?
Yeah, we're out of time. So
Unfortunately, we have 2 hours. But
Thank you.
maybe we can continue on that question in the next. Mr. Lemay, please.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, and thank you to your team for being here with us this morning. Minister, I would like to begin by drawing your attention to the presence of Mr. Ghislain Picard here in the room, who is the leader of the Quebec and First Nations, Quebec Association of First Nations. He is accompanied today with many young people, children, parents, people who also couldn't come along today, but people who have concerns about education in Quebec. I'll come back to that at a later date. Mr. Minister, I had an opportunity to look at a document that's called Funding Basic Services for First Nations. It's a document from your department. I promise I didn't pinch it. In Annex F, it mentions in November 2006 events, and it is from your department. Now I'm going to quote it so as everything is clear. And this document says that even with the budget 2007-2008 that you are preparing, there is a shortfall that has been verified by people in your department, and a shortfall of $938 million annually. And that's what's needed just to catch up. I'm not going to go into all the details. I'm sure you're familiar with the document yourself, Minister. This is something that I find deeply troubling. I read your presentation, and on page 32 of your presentation, and again I'm quoting what you yourself said, as I have already said, it is not enough to continue to fund current programs without checking and verifying their effectiveness. My question, as somebody from a Quebec television show would say, the question that kills. Minister, are you stopping funding the First Nations in order to audit and verify the effectiveness and the validity of the current programs? Are you stopping the funding? Because that's the way I understand what's written here. I hope you're going to tell me that that's not the case, but I will let you obviously give your answer. Tell me, how is it that since 1998, Minister, so I'm not blaming you, I have to look to the right as well, but without getting into partisan politics, let's talk about this issue of education, because that's something that concerns me. About the funding formula. Even to this day, the funding formula does not take into consideration the costs of integrating technology into schools. To put that simply, it means there are no computers in schools. How is it that young Aboriginal children in schools, they don't have computers in their schools? Then you've got the costs of running libraries in schools. There's no money for libraries, and that's something I can promise you. I went to check it myself. I went to look into Miskamang First Nations, and I also went to check in my own riding. Then there are costs related to professional training. No money for that. How is that? How does that happen? Then you've got out-of-school activities such as sport and leisure activities. No, nothing planned for that. That's absolutely fine. I think my question's perfectly clear, and I need a clear answer from you, Minister. Thank you for your question. I very much appreciate it. You asked a lot of questions within the comment that you made.
Let me just deal firstly with the issue of the expenditures and the document which you're referring to of November of 2006. This refers to certain services, basic services that are provided by First Nations and funded in part by the Government of Canada. What that does not reflect are the additional investments which this government has made. They do not reflect, for example, the $300 million included in Budget 2006 for off-reserve housing, nor the $300 million in Budget 2006 for northern housing, nor the $150 million additional in Budget 2006 applied to education, family services, women, children, those kinds of issues. Nor does it include the $300 million applied to on-reserve funding for private housing initiative this year. All of those are incremental to and in addition to what you're speaking of in terms of the Government of Canada's programs and services. So you need to look at the overall picture, which is a $10.2 billion envelope of program and service expenditures, the vast majority of which is to administer to on-reserve citizens, and the vast majority of which is administered by First Nations themselves. Now, in terms of education, there's much that we could say about education, and one could go back to the era of the residential school situation. In the time since then, the Government of Canada has been working towards a system where there are individual funding arrangements for individual First Nations. The Government of Canada essentially puts forward $1.667 billion per year towards education. Of that, $1.123 billion is expended on elementary and secondary education, $314 million, as you know from your study on post-secondary education, $229 million on other issues, which includes special education and also administration. The dollars that are being expended are in total expended on about 125,000 children in schools. And if you do the math, you'll see that that works out to something in the neighborhood of $10,000 per student. in terms of actual dollars that are provided. The comparison that many people make is to compare that to what is being spent in the provincial school system, and it is roughly comparable. It is slightly less than in some provinces, slightly more in others. On some of the provinces like Alberta, which are extremely well funded, it is difficult to keep up. But by and large, it is a fair comparative expenditure. One of the challenges we do face is the large cost of capital investments in remote communities in the construction of schools. A school that might typically cost $9 or $10 million to build in southern Canada and Ontario or Quebec, costs are running $20 to $30 million in northern communities, especially communities where everything has to be brought in on winter roads. So we continue to wrestle with those issues. I've made it very clear that education is a priority. There are no funding cuts to education. That is not the case. There's no funding being stopped to education authorities. Rather, we're trying to work forward with the British Columbia model, taking it to other provinces, Quebec included, because it is First Nation driven. It will create a school system with the support of First Nations that will work hand in hand with the adjoining provincial school system to give First Nation children the opportunities that they need. And Mr. Lemay, I agree with your sentiment that nothing that we do is more important than education.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Madam Crowder, please.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for coming before the committee today. And I also want to acknowledge the elders and the chiefs and the young people that came here to bear witness today. It's an important event for people to come and hear about the issues that the Canadian government is discussing. I have two questions, and I'm going to ask them both. The first one is a fairly short question. Back when you came before the committee back in 2006, I raised the issue about the funding for the BC Treaty Commission. And in the estimates from 2006-2007, there was a specific line for funding for the BC Treaty Commission process of $0.2 million, and I couldn't find it in this year's estimate, so I just want to confirm that funding for the BC Treaty Commission process is still there. I'm going to go on and ask my second question so that you can just have them all at once. I also want to come back to education. I know that you have publicly stated your commitment to the importance of education. As you know, this committee looked at post-secondary education, but there are a couple of things that I think we need clarification on. There's a well-acknowledged 2% cap that's been in place since 1996. The Auditor General herself has pointed out the fact that population growth on reserve is far above the Canadian average. In the cost drivers project that the department had put together, they talked about funding shortfalls needing to be met for education around internal reallocation of resources. They talk about the fact that per student expenditure for instructional services for provincial schools is growing at twice the rate of the same expenditure at the band-operated schools. They talk about the fact that the socioeconomic influences are often not taken into consideration, so remedial programs related to basic skills, nutrition programs, extracurricular programs associated with sports and recreation, after-school programs that enhance the school experience. These real costs are not taken into consideration. And that the band-operated funding formula study, which I know is causing great distress amongst communities across this country about the lack of progress on the band-operated funding formula. Now, in addition to that, in the estimates from 2006-2007, when education, now again, I realize that these were estimates, but when you looked at the funds allocated for education activity in 2006-2007, in 2006 they projected spending 1.66.
Yep.
And then the projection for 2007-2008 was actually 1.79, so 1.8 basically. That was the projection for 2007-2008, yet when we come to the figures in the actual 2007-2008 figures, it's actually 1.67. So it seemed that in 2006, 2007, when the estimates were created, there was this projection of this increased need, and yet it's dropped fairly significantly when the actual estimates were put forward in 2007, 2008. In addition, I also want to, you raised the issue around the fact that around an average of $10,000 goes to band for children on reserves for education, and it's around 10,000. I know, for example, that there are a number of band-operated schools that don't get nearly the $10,000. Some of them are getting as low as $7,200 or less, and that in many rural and remote communities, that additional money that's required to operate in a rural and remote community, and I've got a study that was done through the First Nations Education Council that says that provinces actually recognize these differences, and they fund anywhere between $10,000 to $21,000. And this is across provinces all across Canada. So I guess there's two questions. One is why, given the fact in 2006, 2007, the government was projecting spending 1.7, and it's actually come down substantially less to 1.6. What's changed? Because we know the need has increased. What is the government doing to address the very serious needs in rural and remote communities in terms of those gaps in funding between what the government is providing and what the province is providing? And if you could answer the question on the BC Treaty Commission.
Okay, thank you. Good questions. The BC Treaty Commission, the $0.2 million, I'm not just sure which line entry you're referring to, but it doesn't matter. The important point is that we've just recently advanced the annual allotment to the BC Treaty Commission, which, as I recall from memory, was about $35 million that was put forward. And
fully funded to 2009.
And we carry on with the BC Treaty process, which is fully funded right through to 2009. Absolutely. There's no change of anything there. Now, I will tell you, and I'm sure you have thoughts about this that you and I haven't had a chance to exchange yet, but there are significant questions being asked about the BC Treaty process. The Auditor General has offered comments about it. As a nation, we are at this point have invested close to $1 billion on the negotiations in British Columbia. And with the exception of the 3 agreements that I initialed as minister, there have been no agreements reached under that system. So it has raised some significant questions about why and what the problems are and what kind of changes need to be made. And that's another dialogue that you and I can have. But I can assure you that the BC Treaty process continues to be funded and move forward at an inexorable pace. In terms of your second question, the difference between the projection of 1.79 and the supplementary estimates of 1.6 billion, I'll have to just determine why we have that difference. It's certainly not a case of reducing expenditures. In fact, I can tell you above and beyond the education numbers that we're talking about, the 1.66 billion, we have been making additional capital investments. In the last 6 months alone, I've announced new schools that would total over $60 million in a variety of locations. And we try to be responsive to the needs of individual communities. You're aware I went to Pekanjicum, and maybe it's useful to focus on a specific illustration, but I went to Pekanjicum and I found a community of about 2,000 people, a school built for 300 children with 700 children in it. And no one to this point had done anything about that. I met with the community. We announced capital investments into Pekanjicum of $47 million to ensure that the community has firstly hydro, followed by sewer and water, and a new school as part of that. As I recall, the school was about $17 million. So that's the kind of steps that we need to make on individual communities. The biggest challenge with the education system, I would submit, is not the dollars per se. It is rather the absence of an overall school system, which individual schools are part of. Previous governments have created a system in this country where individual First Nations schools are one-off schools that are operating outside any school system. And it's fair to say that it's not working very well. We are achieving the lowest educational outcomes, certainly anywhere in Canada, and amongst the lowest in any Western democracy from this approach. The first step to change that is what you and I both know we've done in British Columbia, and the challenge is to now move that forward across the country, make the structural changes, and deal with the funding issues. But at the end of the day, we currently operate in a circumstance where all of this money is going to First Nations. It is not being frittered away on administration. The Department of Indian and Northern Affairs has only 34 people working in the education area. So virtually all of the dollars we're talking about makes its way through to First Nation communities who are then responsible to run their own schools.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. To the government side, Mr. Benitez, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister Prentice, for coming today before our committee. Perhaps we could get you to talk a bit about the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. I know that upon taking office, it was one of your priorities, but sometimes I think as parliamentarians we forget that I think we sat for the first time in early April of 2006, and it was in May that this agreement was ratified. And as a new parliamentarian, I thought that was just par for the course kind of operations of government. But now that I've been here a year, I realize that that was rather expedited. But so I guess my question would be more along the lines of if you could give further detail to the way the agreement has unfolded subsequent to that expedited ratification in May of last year, and talk a bit about some of the advance payments. And I have a few more questions as well after that.
Well, thank you. The residential school agreement is something, of course, of historic importance. It was pulled together in pretty incredible time as one looks back at this point. But I think it's an agreement that all Canadians can take pride in. And it involved a court ratification process that, of course, we had to work through, which has not actually completely finished yet. The ratification process required the approval of judges in 9 different jurisdictions. Those approvals have now been secured. We're now into what is known as the opt-out period, which completes or expires about mid-September. And once we're through the opt-out period, assuming everything is set to go, we will be into the actual rollout of the common experience payments. The common experience payments are budgeted to be $1.9 billion. They should be in the hands of most First Nation citizens by this fall, the latter part of the year. And I think you're aware as well that in addition to that, there was $125 million provided to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Since the court approval doesn't vest until this fall, we found it necessary to provide bridge financing, if you will, to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and that has been put in place, so that's been taken care of. We're also dealing with the legal fee issues and moving forward on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is budgeted for another $60 million. And I must say, of the many positive aspects of the agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think, is first and foremost about us coming to grips with all of this as a country. And it's something I believed in quite fervently from going back to my days in opposition and experience I previously had in South Africa. But my sense is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the work that they do will help achieve healing for this country. I've already seen indications that that in fact is happening, and that it will be a great success in that regard. We're now engaged in the process of selecting the commissioners, the three distinguished Canadians who will, at the end of the day, head up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We've actually engaged in a process to select the process by which these people will be selected, so that there can be no criticism whatsoever that they are respected Canadians, known for their integrity beyond criticism or reproach, and they will head this up. So we're all looking forward to that. It's going to be very exciting, and I think it will help us achieve closure. So this is a historic agreement, which we are well along to the implementation. I can tell you the numbers of payments that we expect. We also provided advance payments to the elderly, and that, of course, has been taken care of over the past many months. The total value of the payments to the elderly were $82.6 million, and as I recall, there were approximately 13,500 people who have applied. So those are the numbers in terms of the advance payments to the elderly. The anticipated recipients of the residential school common experience payments is, of course, much larger, I should say, expected to be in the vicinity of about 80,000 First Nation Canadians. So it's a great news story, and we're moving forward, and it's important as a country to put this behind us, and I'm satisfied in the fullness of time we will.
How much?
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay. Perhaps if you could just explain a little further how the opt-out process works. I know that it's integral to the agreement finally being ratified, and if you could highlight some of those details for us to get better understanding as to the timing of when it's going to finally be ratified, and also if you could just give me some further understanding as to when the Healing Foundation and Truth and Reconciliation process will formally begin.
Okay. Well, let me deal firstly with the common experience payments and the opt-out clause. Really, what the residential school agreement does is it closes the most complicated class action lawsuits in Canadian history. Class action lawsuits that had in excess, as I recall, of 30,000 individual plaintiffs who had sued the Government of Canada in a variety of forums. So this is not simply an agreement that gives effect to social objectives. It's actually an agreement that achieves the resolution of the most complicated and difficult lawsuits that the country's experienced. The effect of the agreement will be that all of the claims of both people who attended residential schools and their descendants will be extinguished as part of the court-approved settlement. And as a result, it's necessary to ensure that those people who are entitled to benefit under the agreement have a chance to opt out, have a chance to make a conscious choice that they don't want to be part of this settlement, they don't want to extinguish their claim or the claim of their children, and they therefore have the legal ability under the court process to make a decision to walk away from the settlement and opt out. If enough people opt out, then the agreement collapses, or rephrased, the agreement becomes voidable at the option of the Government of Canada, and that threshold is 5,000 individuals. We're making progress at this point. There's actually a very small number of individuals who have opted out at this point, which I think speaks well of the agreement. We don't anticipate that we will be near that opt-out threshold, but that call really can't be made until September of this year. So once we're through the opt-out period, then the agreement can be properly applied to everyone who is a recipient, a beneficiary under the agreement. And we expect to make progress there. The implementation will be in September of this year. That's when we move into the implementation phase. Peter Harrison, to my right, is a very experienced individual with the Government of Canada with a lifetime of experience. He has been brought to the department for, well, actually to heads up the department for Indian residential school settlement, and is responsible for the full administration of this and is doing an excellent job at it.
Thank you. Madam Curtak Lindell, we're beginning the 5-minute round now. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here, and also to everyone that's here to listen today. A lot to cover in our second round with only 5 minutes, but I'm just going to take your comment that the residential school having gone so well was actually a compliment to the previous government, who pretty well, I think, settled it, and all you need to do is carry it through. Because everyone else has asked questions on other areas, I'm going to focus more on economic development. As I look through some of the planned spending, I see a lot of decreases going down, or a lot of decreases in the areas that have something to do with economic development. The clarity of title to lands and resources, economic development for Aboriginal people and economic development, northern land and resources, even community infrastructure. Those I see as all key parts of fostering good economic development in our communities, and I see a very big drop. I know you've transferred Aboriginal Business Canada from Industry Canada, which I don't necessarily agree with either, because the expertise was in Industry Canada, and I thought we were moving to a phase where economic development was economic development, not just because it's Aboriginal people that it has to be under Indian Affairs. So to explain why there is such a drop in that, because the Aboriginal Business Canada is only 49.1 on the next page. That doesn't account for all the different reductions in that. And a little bit on your relationship with organizations that represent Aboriginal people in Canada, that we're hearing a lot through our through our Bill C-44 witnesses, that they're not getting an opportunity to really work with you on priority issues. And I see a drop in cooperative relationships too, that the funding's gone down in that, so I don't know if that explains part of it. Because I have a group called the Land Claims Agreements Coalition, who has come together. All the different land claims organizations have come together, which is a rare thing also for them to be able to come together and work together, that they haven't been able to get cooperation on the government side to really implement land claims organizations. And I know, because I don't have that much time, I'll leave the rest with you.
Well, thank you, colleague. You've raised a number of issues. I've given a lengthy speech about the Indian residential school settlement, and I won't recap all of that. I would observe that victory has many fathers and failure is an orphan. And certainly all of the political parties represented at this table had something to say about the residential school matter. But I would simply close by noting that it was this government and myself working together with Mr. Fontaine who negotiated the issues that needed to be resolved to put the agreement in place. It bears our signature, and all of that happened in the opening 3 months of this government. But moving forward, in terms of economic development, I don't think you and I agree on this point. The reason that the economic development authorities were consolidated into INAC related to almost the universal comments that I received from First Nation leaders. And almost without exception, First Nation leaders who I talked to in the early part of my tenure as minister said to me they were deeply unhappy with how the Aboriginal economic development portfolio was not receiving the attention that it needed to receive and which it had received when it formed part of INAC. And I think we all know that economic development is the key to the future for First Nations in particular, and Inuit people as well. And the sense was that if those authorities formed part of the authorities of the Department of Indian Northern Affairs, we would have more direct levers to have a say and to assist in economic development. And in many cases, the economic development initiatives are also on a parallel track with land claim settlements and payments. So it made sense to consolidate them. But the consolidation, I would emphasize, was not my idea. It originated with First Nation leadership who asked me to do it. In terms of what we need to do on a go-forward basis, the National Economic Development Board has been renewed and renovated. In the days ahead, I will announce the new appointments to the board. There were many vacancies on the board when we became the government, and I've had a singular test, which is people who sit on this board need to be First Nation and Inuit leaders who command respect, who are deeply involved in economic development. Most of the people who've agreed to come on this board control hundreds of millions of dollars of assets, if not billions of dollars of assets themselves through their First Nations, or Inuit people, I would emphasize. So they are a remarkable group of Canadians. People will really take notice of who they are, and they will be there to assist us in moving forward with budgetary issues and economic development issues. Excuse me?
We're actually run out of time for the answer to the question, so I'm going to move on to Mr. Albrecht, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here today. I noted throughout your comments, and obviously prior to these comments today, a theme of focusing on economic development. And certainly as I speak to constituents in my riding and also to First Nations people in the last year, that's been one of their primary comments, that's where we'll get the largest value for any new initiatives. You've commented about the unification of the Aboriginal Business Canada and the National Economic Development Board, and you go on to talk about, on page 9, the workplace partnerships with government, with businesses and trade unions to increase the level of employment of the Aboriginal workforce. I'm just wondering what kind of uptake, adoption are you getting of this idea? Because I think if we can include private partnerships in this, it will certainly leverage, as you point out, the amount of government investment and will also create ownership. Is there a early adoption of this principle as you move across Canada? Maybe you've given us some examples here. Maybe there are some others that are waiting in the wings that you could share with us, if that's not divulging private information.
No, absolutely. I can tell you, in terms of, just to complete, my last answer really transits into this one. We also have a new economic development full-time ADM for the first time in the department, and also other staffing that is new and enhanced for the first time to really get on with economic development with First Nations. In terms of these partnerships of which you speak, there's an enormous appetite for these amongst the private sector, and the examples I've illustrated are some of the first and earliest ones that we've engaged in. These are programs that really do work. They are reasonably modest in terms of the financial investment on the part of the Government of Canada, but they allow significant progress in terms of the employment of First Nation citizens by sitting down, working in partnership with a provincial government or a local municipality, in the case of Edmonton, for example, or the private sector, in clearing away the impediments to getting First Nation citizens into job opportunities, and they're very proactive. They are, I think, the whole AWIPI process, as it's called, are something that bears real fruit. There's tangible results. There's immediate results. We're seeing that in all of the places where agreements are signed. And it also focuses individual Canadians in the private sector on their responsibility and their role to go out and recruit First Nation citizens. I was struck, one of the first signing ceremonies I took part in was with the Nursing Association of Nova Scotia. And I asked them how many nurses in their profession were First Nation people, and the number was pretty close to nil. It was quite surprising, and so that's an organization that has taken it upon itself to go out and really recruit young Aboriginal men and women, and to bring them into that profession. And we see the same thing up north in the area of the oil sands in Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, and certainly up in the Northwest Territories. So this is really where the future lies, and I think it's an excellent program.
I agree that it's where the future lies, and I think if the broader Canadian public was made aware of it, they would be totally supportive of it. Do you have any time left there? Just perhaps a quick note about the $300 million and the leverage again by making this available through CMHC, and if you could just flesh that out in the next 45 seconds, it would be helpful.
Okay. Well, I think this, in terms of structural changes, which previous governments have not been prepared to do, and our government is, this is extremely important. This has gone from being an idea 10 years ago to being the way of the future. And I'm not naive enough to think that this will satisfy all of the housing needs in all of the First Nations across the country, but it will meet part of the demand that exists. And there's $300 million that the government has put forward. The banks will lever off that with an additional $1.5 billion or thereabouts. All of those dollars are available to First Nations who want to construct private on-reserve housing. It is already starting. We're already starting to see the interest in this. Applications are coming in. It'll be rolled out and implemented in the spring of 2008. But it already works. And I would emphasize that this is an idea that, again, came from First Nations. It comes from places like Lac La Ronge in Saskatchewan, Chief Darcy Bear's community in Saskatchewan, other places where First Nation private housing has been tried and is working. And in closing, Mr. Chairman, on this point, I would simply say I felt for some time nothing is more important than the right of a First Nation citizen, if they choose to own their own house, to build up their own equity, to draw on that equity for the education of their children or for their retirement in the same way that all Canadians do.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Levesque, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Minister, firstly, I'm delighted with the cooperation that we've had with the Quebec First Nations, but there are some aspects that haven't been so successful. I don't know if you remember in 1977 that there were consultations with the First Nations. On page 1 of your report, you mentioned C44 and the repeal of section 67 on page 7 of your report. I'd like to begin my comments by addressing this matter. Obviously, everybody agrees that First Nations peoples ought to have the same legislation, be covered by the same legislation as Canadians elsewhere in the country. In giving responsibilities and obligations to First Nations, you have to make sure they have the resources to live up to these obligations. If you look at what has been happening in terms of education, we have seen that there have been problems. Young people aren't even finishing primary school because there's not even enough money for the primary schools. Shortage of teachers, shortage of money. And today, once again, we're talking about education, talking about the importance of having teachers that are trained to give classes. How is it then that you can ask First Nations to live up to the same obligations that other Canadians have to respect compared to their population without having the resources? And then there's a C51, and that's about land claims in Nunavik. C51 was tabled a fair while ago in the House. The committee was unanimous that this bill be fast-tracked. It was a commitment that your government had made to the Inuk people. We agreed with it being fast-tracked. It was a good commitment. Everybody agreed with it. Tell me then, how is it that today we haven't even got to second reading in the House of this bill? I'm talking obviously about C51 when I refer to the bill. Thank you. I will be speaking in English with your indulgence.
Legislation Bill C51 is at the House. The issue is whether there is going to be a clause-by-clause review by this committee, and if so, when that is going to happen, or whether that is frankly necessary. There is a second bill that relates to the province of Quebec, which has been working its way through the Senate, Bill S6, which relates to the bijuralization, if you will. It's an extremely important bill. It's inexplicable why it has not happened to this point, but all of the modern self-government legislation that has been brought into place over the last number of years was not brought in place for Quebec First Nations at the same time. So we wish to rectify that. I anticipate that both of those bills will be before the House in the way that you anticipate, hopefully very quickly, so that we can deal with them and move forward. So that's something that you and I and Mr. Lemay and others will continue to work together on. So I wish to see those two bills enacted as law as quickly as possible, and I think that we can achieve that. With respect to Bill C-44, I must say, this is a piece of legislation that gives to First Nation citizens the protection of Canada's Human Rights Act. And I don't think that the Parliamentary Committee should study this endlessly. The operative clause of the bill is only 9 words long, and it says that Section 67 of Canada's Human Rights Act is hereby repealed, and that would lift a barrier that would prevent a First Nation woman, for example, who's not satisfied with the quality of education that her child is receiving, from filing a complaint, a grievance, either against the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, whoever that happens to be, or against her own council if she feels that that's where the issue isn't being dealt with. So this is one of the elements of modern governance that clearly has to be available to First Nation citizens as we move forward to self-government. And I think it's wrong that First Nation citizens in Canada do not have the right to file human rights grievances the way other Canadians do. I think it will advantage women and children significantly, and I ask for the committee's cooperation. The committee has been studying this subject now for 16 weeks. And I think it's time the committee move this bill back to the House of Commons, and if at that time the opposition parties do not support the concept of Canada's First Nation citizens having human rights protection, you will be afforded an opportunity to stand up and cast a vote. But let's get this issue back to the House of Commons and move forward. And this committee has much other important work to do.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Stortheth, please.
Chair. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for coming forward to discuss the main estimates with this committee today. I have to admit, I think the committee is a little disappointed when we first arranged to have you here for 2 hours. I believe all members were hoping to have C-44 pass, so hopefully your presence will inspire some renewed invigoration on this file. Minister, I do want to say that in my constituency, people are very impressed with leadership that you have shown on this file. Leadership in going to places like Pikangikum and seeing these issues firsthand and being willing to tackle these things firsthand when other members of Parliament, quite frankly, aren't willing to go there and do some of this dirty work. Minister, water safety is an issue that is all too often taken for granted by average Canadians. In my area, however, having access to safe drinking water is unfortunately something that many of our First Nations people on reserve have long been denied. The department's main estimates include a sizable increase in funding for water safety initiatives. Could you please outline for our committee, Minister, the direction you are taking to ensure safe water for First Nations people living on reserve?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind comments. And I think you're one of the visitations that I know you're referring to was my trip to Pikangikum, and I'd suggested that members of this committee might come there, either alone or with me, to meet people in the Pikangikum community. And you know, I must say this government has responded to the circumstances that we found in that community. Drinking water is an issue in that community because there is no hydro connection in Pikangikum. And since there's no hydro connection, it's impossible to electrify the pipes so that there's running water or running sewer. And I would say, and people need to know this, all that the people of Pikangikum had to show from their relationship with the previous government was an acrimonious lawsuit that had been going on, and frankly an expenditure of $7 million to run a hydro line into the community, which resulted in power poles being basically laying around in the ground and outdated equipment stored in Quonset huts. And the power line was not advanced 10 feet, despite the expenditures of $7 million. That's not how this government conducts itself. That's maybe how others have. So we went there. We announced a program to connect Pikangikum to hydro and then to provide water, sewer, and school. An investment of $47 million in that community. So that's the sort of initiatives that we're moving forward. Drinking water. When I became the minister, I inherited a circumstance where far too many First Nations were operating with high-risk drinking water systems. In the previous parliament, we all saw the consequences of that, places like Kasheshawan and other communities. I asked for an inventory when I became the minister of how many places there were in this country where First Nation citizens were at risk because of the quality of the drinking water. I was told, after all the material was assembled, there were 193 communities where First Nation Canadians were operating with high risk or worse drinking water systems. And what is worse than high risk is a community itself being at risk, and there were 21 of those communities that we inherited from the previous administration. We've taken real steps to reduce that. The number of 193 has been reduced down to 97 at last count. And we've dealt with as many of the 21 communities as we can. Some of these require investments and the actual construction of new water plants. And we're making significant progress. So our approach with water, and I've just had meetings with the government of Saskatchewan last week and First Nation leaders. They want Saskatchewan to be the model of the way forward for our country, where we will work together in concert, the government of Saskatchewan, the government of Canada, First Nation governments, to ensure that all of the drinking water systems in Saskatchewan are up to standard, and that we enact standards that will apply so that Saskatchewan citizens, Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, have the same water standards that apply to them, and we can move forward with systems that sometimes are integrated across reserve boundaries. So we're making progress. It's a big job, and I'm pleased with the progress that we made. Again, It will be necessary to move forward in a legislative way, and legislation will come to this committee that deals with the way forward to ensure that First Nation citizens have the same water standards as other Canadians.
Thank you. Madam Crowder, please.
Chair, and I'm sure the minister is well aware that we've had 150 years plus of abject neglect, discrimination, and assimilationist, even genocidal policies that both Conservatives and Liberal governments need to own. So it's not just a favourite phrase in the House of the last 13 years. There has been over a century of neglect. And I think that there are a number of line items that I could address in the budget, but I think the overall issue comes down to what has commonly referred to as the 2% cap. And when you look at the fact that, by comparison, the CHT, CST payments to the province are rising by 6.6% per year and protected by legislation against inflation, that the Auditor General pointed out that funding for First Nations programs has increased, but not at the rate equal to population growth. And she goes on to talk about the fact that the average increase worked out to 1.6% excluding inflation, but that population actually increased by 11.2%. And then in the department's own cost drivers document, it says the rationale is that after 9 years of a 2% cap, the time has come to fund First Nations basic service costs so that population and price growth are covered in the new and subsequent years. Over the period of the 2% cap, departmental per capita constant dollar expenditures for basic services have declined by 6%. So when I look at the estimates that come before us, and from the department's own extensive work on the serious underfunding in housing, water, education, economic development, land claims, you name it, in almost every single category, the department itself has identified serious underfunding. The Auditor General has identified serious underfunding. And although there are some increases in the proposed funding, when you make statements like Bill C-44 will allow a woman to file a complaint about quality childcare, but you and I both know she can file a complaint till the cows come home. If you don't provide the funding, she can't access quality childcare anyway. So what is the government's plan to address the issues that have been identified in the cost drivers project about the consistent underfunding as a result of the 2% cap?
Well, firstly, I don't agree with the premise of your question. In terms of the expenditures that the Government of Canada makes, we can isolate the 2% cap issue that relates to some of the expenditures. I'm happy to talk about that. But at the end of the day, the reality is that the Government of Canada expends $10.2 billion on programs and services that are largely directed to 448,000 on-reserve citizens in this country. And that is a very significant amount of money. And what we need to ensure, first and foremost, is that those dollars are being well targeted, being well expended, and that we are getting results, and we're working on that. In addition, in terms of the 2% cost driver analysis that you're talking about, I've made the point earlier, it does not reflect all of the other expenditures which have been built into the budgets, the last two budgets of this Conservative government, which provide for increases in expenditures in targeted areas where we wish to see results. And that includes women, children, and education. Now, that $10.2 billion, therefore, reflects other expenditures which are not capped or in any way, which have been put forward as single approval payments to deal with many of these issues. The other assumption that underlies your concern relates to what percentage of the cost of governmental services in a First Nation should be borne by the Government of Canada. Is it 100 cents on the dollar? Is it, do you advocate a situation where 100 cents on every dollar that is expended by a First Nation government comes from the Government of Canada?
Well, actually, what I would say is and I think that it would make sense to sit down with First Nations and, on a nation-to-nation basis, develop a plan to address this. The Government of Canada took on a responsibility over 150 years ago that it now can't abandon because in their view, it's become far too expensive. And
well, I'm not suggesting that it be abandoned by any means. This government is expending $10.2 billion. That's $1.1 billion more than the previous Liberal government expended on Aboriginal programs and services. It's a very large amount of funding.
But that also includes the hundreds of Department of Justice lawyers that the government pays to actually fight court claims. You're saying it doesn't include, so the $10.2 billion doesn't include Department of Justice?
I don't believe it includes the Department of Justice. It includes expenditures on the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. That's like 4% of, in terms of administration costs. I mean, most of this money, the lion's share of this money, is paid out as grants and contributions by the Government of Canada to First Nations, who are then responsible for the expenditures.
$5 to $6 billion.
Okay, thank you.
But that's not the other $4 billion.
Moving on to Mr. Blaney, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et permettez-moi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, thank you for coming here. This is the third time you've been here with your very experienced team. I'd also like to welcome Chief Picard and the Chief of the Association of Timiskaming and other representatives from Quebec. So I'd like to welcome all of you to our committee. You're always welcome to attend our committee meetings. Mr. Minister, you were at the Socioeconomic Forum where we talked about education, and there was an agreement signed with the First Nations, or a significant number of First Nations. We also discussed housing at this First Nations Forum. This morning in your presentation you talked about something that I believe to be important, and that is the Market Housing Fund, access to that fund. You talked about some 25,000 extra housing units over the next 10 years, $300 million for this in 2007. Within a Quebec context, at the forum, we talked about the importance of changing tact and looking at a different approach to try and address the housing problem. Tell me, in the Quebec context, how do you think this housing lodgement is going to help address the problem of the shortage of housing? Thank you.
The figure of 25,000 housing units is an assessment of the shortfall. Not everyone agrees on what that figure is. There are many who think it's significantly higher, but the 25,000 is the department's assessment of the shortfall of houses amongst First Nation citizens. The issue becomes how to address that shortfall. Should every single one of those houses be a social house provided by the Government of Canada, or are there First Nation citizens who are interested in owning their own property? And we know that across Canada, including, I hope, in Quebec, there are First Nations who wish to come forward and have private housing on reserve owned by the First Nation citizens themselves. In the context of Quebec, Bill S6 becomes extremely important because it is Bill S6 that provides the clearest and fastest method for First Nations to be able to access that opportunity. And again, it's very surprising that this wasn't done previously, but essentially First Nations in Quebec have not had the same opportunities other First Nations have had in Canada. Other First Nations have essentially been able to move out from under the Indian Act in cases where they are ready, willing, and able, and that hasn't been possible in the same way in Quebec because of the absence of legislation. So Bill S6 remedies that, and it's one of the reasons I'd like to see that bill through the House, from the Senate into the House approved immediately, because there are First Nations in Quebec who wish to move forward on private housing. The other thing I would just emphasize, because there has been some scaremongering on this, but the concept of private on-reserve housing does not equate to a breaking up of Indian reserves and disposition of land. The way in which this has been structured, it allows First Nation communities to continue to hold their land base collectively, but through things such as certificates of possession or long-term, essentially the equivalent of a long-term lease, allows individual citizens to own their own property. And there is no risk that it will lead to a balkanization, dismemberment of reserves. That's not the point.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Donc, on a parlé...
Thank you, Minister. We have talked about housing then. I've just got a minute left. I would like to talk about the First Nations strategy in an urban environment, but it's a bit difficult to ask you to talk about that because we've only got a minute left. But I find that it's an interesting initiative because there are many First Nations people living in urban settings now. But I know I've not very much time, so I can come back to this at a later date.
Announced, Mr. Chairman, in Edmonton about 3 weeks ago. It's been a very successful approach. It was originally developed as a concept many years ago. It was not actually funded, as I recall, until 2003. This government has moved forward. We've refocused it, retargeted the expenditure of funds, and have extended the application from, as I recall, 8 major urban cities to 12. I think it's a good program. I think it's yielding exceptional results. It achieves a high amount of leverage because in individual cities, people take the funds that are received and they approach private sources, First Nation sources, municipal sources, provincial sources, and achieve a leverage, as I recall, in Calgary and Edmonton in particular, of 2 to 1 or 4 to 1. So it's yielding specific results for especially First Nation women and children who have left reserves and who are moving to the cities.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Committee members, we've finished 2 rounds. I'm going to continue on the third round, the 5-minute round, until 10 minutes to the hour, and then I'll be calling for the question on the votes. Mr. Russell.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Minister, and to all of those gathered here this morning. I would just say by way of observation that much of the success is going to depend on relationships, and how those relationships are fostered. It's going to depend on effective consultation and dealing in a respectful and honourable way with First Nations, Inuit and Métis people across Canada. I would only observe that from a high in terms of the relationship between government and Aboriginal peoples across Canada in November of 2005 with the Kelowna Accord, I can't remember. I was involved for about 13 years. I can't remember a lower time or a more tense time in terms of the relationship with the federal government and Aboriginal peoples since Oka, about 15 years ago. But and when it comes to relationships, let's go directly to claims that you mentioned, which is one of those basic building blocks, and it's supposed to sort of, I guess, solidify Aboriginal people's relationships with the Crown for some time to come. Why does the priorities and planning document indicate that when it comes to claims settlement, we're going to go from $523 million in 07-08 to $152 million in 08-09, and then $143 in 09 to 10? If we're talking about settling land claims and moving on with it in an aggressive way, hopefully in a respectful way, why decline the expenditures under that line item?
Pleased to answer that, but let me just first respond to your initial assertion, and you and I have known each other for many years in a respectful way. I don't agree with your assessment, and I think if you talk to the leadership of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians, the Union of Ontario Indians, the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 councils in Alberta, the Union of British Columbia Indians, the BC Leadership Council. All of these organizations will tell you that, in their view, this is one of the best governments that they have ever worked with on the ground getting things done. And as I say, you and I have known each other. If you have different information, please feel free to pass it on. We'll be discussing it in a respectful way. But I can tell you, because I've met with all of these organizations in the last 2 weeks, and that's precisely what they're saying. Now, let me come to land claims, which was your question. There's no intent to reduce the importance of land claims. What you've seized upon is reflection in the budget documents that show the number of claims that are in the system. So the reduction from $523 million this year to $152 million next year to $143 million the year after that, it simply reflects specific claims that have been settled, but the communities haven't yet ratified the settlement. So the dollars, in a sense, are held in suspense until such time as there's ratification of the agreement. So the $523 million simply represents a balloon amount which relates to, as I recall, about 25 settlements which we've negotiated and which cannot yet be paid out because there hasn't been a community ratification or a final settlement. And frankly, if those settlements aren't ratified this year, those dollars will then carry forward and they will add to the $152 million next year. So it's, in a sense, a running total of where we are on specific claim settlements. The other part of it is that those numbers reflect multi-year settlement payments. So, for example, the claim you're well aware of, the Labrador Inuit land claim, there were budgeted payments. It was resolved 3 years ago. There were budgeted payments over 3 years. Those payments begin to subside after this year, so the dollars obviously reduce. And there's other comprehensive claims like that.
So the 152 in 08-09, what does that figure reflect? Like, is there any anticipation of further settlements of specific or comprehensive claims that would adjust that figure? And would that be the same for 09-010?
It would reflect essentially a base amount that projects the number of claims that will come to fruition in that year. As you know, it's taken a long time, sometimes too long, to negotiate specific claims. And the $152 million is reflects where we think we will be 2 years out in terms of the number of claims that will land. But it does not restrict the department in its ability to settle specific claims. So that the number is simply a projection going forward of based on what we know today.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Benoos, please. We're out of time.
Unfortunately, Mr. Russell, 5 minutes does go rather fast.
Good try.
I'd make a comment on Newfoundland time, but you know, anyways, Minister, we have maintained a civil tone today, so I'm not going to stray away from that. But I would like to point out that Mr. Russell did make a comment about the early 90s, and then yet again today, but forgetting conveniently, a period of time where his party was in government and could have reformed some of the systems that bring land claims to a settlement. And we did see a massive growth in the land claims that were put before the Government of Canada over that period of time. And I know this is something that's very important to you, but I didn't want to talk about that. I just had to make reference to it in light of the comments I heard. But, Mr. Minister... Yeah, definitely. Mr. Minister, it was something that I find very interesting, and I know you do as well, is the area of demographics that face Canada as we see mainstream society choosing, or just really the reality of the mainstream society, not continuing to grow the Canadian population at large, with birth rates being very low, comparable to the European crisis. And we've heard statistics from our government recently indicating that by the year 2020, nearly all of our population growth is going to come from immigration. In light of our demographic issues and, of course, our quickly growing economy, some could argue one of the best in the world, definitely tops in the G8, we have a large need for employable individuals. And I guess, my line of questioning would be more along the area of Aboriginal population growth, which is actually going against the trend and is doing very well. And you've taken an interest in bringing economic opportunity to First Nations people. I had the opportunity to be involved with the signing of an agreement with Siemens Canada to begin developing human resource models for First Nations people. How do you see our government being able to further growth in this area, as it is such an important issue facing our country in the next few years?
Well, if I might just say, I think it's an extraordinary opportunity that we face as a country, because the world demands and is prepared to acquire Canadian products and Canadian resource products. In particular, are in hot demand. And many of the projects that we're talking about that are principal economic drivers in Canada are located in situations where First Nation communities are proximate to those developments, and in some cases are actually resource owners. So I think the future is very bright indeed if we focus on that opportunity and direct our efforts. If you look at the projections of employment requirements in northern Alberta, up the Mackenzie Valley in the Northwest Territories, in Nunavut, northern Saskatchewan and other places, and look at some of the hydro projects in Quebec and Labrador, the potential of all of these things, there are extraordinary employment opportunities for First Nation kids, young people. Our challenge is to get those young people through high school, first and foremost, so that they're in a position to make a choice to go on to university or post-secondary or to be in the job market. But I think we all know that if one doesn't finish high school in today's day and age, it's very difficult to have meaningful participation in the workforce. We're working together closely with industry, and there are some very willing partners, such as the Government of British Columbia, the Government of Alberta, and industrial leaders who want to sit down and talk about employment opportunities and how we structure government programming to ensure that young First Nation citizens are recruited and take part in the workforce. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out we're making real progress in this country. I think one of the members might have mentioned themselves that in the diamond mines, 30% of the workers are First Nation citizens. At Voisey's Bay, it's between 40 and 50% of citizens are Aboriginal people. In Fort McKay, the Fort McKay First Nation is a major development of an oil sands project. So these things are starting to happen in a very positive way, and it spells much for the future of the country.
Thank you. Mr. Lemay, just a concise question. We're just about out of time.
Merci.
Thank you. Minister, I would like to follow up from what your parliamentary secretary was saying in just a moment, but before that, I would like to say that in the near future, you will be receiving an invite to the first brick that will be laid for the First Nations Pavilion. And I hope you will come to Picogan. It's a community under Treaty 9. It's near Amos. And in the next few days or the next few weeks, the community will be expanding. There will be this building being built, and I hope that you'll get an invitation to come along for the first brick that will be laid. I've got a question. I think it will be the last question for the day. what's happening in terms of the Declaration of First Nations at the United Nations? What's Canada's position with regard to that? Are there going to be any changes to the money being provided for that?
To the estimates that we're studying, so if you wish to speak to the Minister privately on that question, you can do so. We're to the point now that we need to deal with the votes here. I want to thank the witnesses and the Minister for being with us today, and really do appreciate you taking the time, Mr. Minister, and for the answers to the questions. Obviously, your department is working hard to resolve some of the issues facing our First Nations communities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I might just in closing acknowledge the fine work of our Deputy Minister, Mr. Mike Wernick, who has a challenging job and who serves the people of Canada and First Nation citizens with real distinction.
Thank you. Committee, I have called the vote. One, under the Indian Affairs and Northern Development Canada. Shall the vote carry? All those in favour? Opposed? Now we have the Chair asks the Committee for unanimous consent to call votes 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, L30, L35, 40, 45, 50, 55, and 60 on one question. All in favour? Shall the votes carry? On division? All in favour? Shall the Chair report the votes to the House? All agreed? Thank you very much. We all done? Adjourn.